Robb Stark sat quietly in his tent, the candlelight flickering across his war map. Outside, the north whispered in the wind, cold, bitter, and restless. News of Theon's betrayal had burned through the camp like wildfire. Winterfell had fallen, Bran and Rickon were presumed dead, and the Boltons had seized control in the chaos. Robb's rage had been a beast he couldn't tame at first. He had sworn to bring Theon's head back to the north himself, but time had passed. Not much, but enough for pain to harden into thought, enough for regret to creep in. He was raised among us, Robb muttered to himself, staring down at a carved wooden direwolf that stood tall over the Iron Islands on the map. He was a brother, and I abandoned him. Catelyn had been the first to suggest it. "Forgiveness is not weakness, Robb," she'd said, her voice both stern and gentle. "You've made mistakes too." Perhaps Theon's betrayal was a plea for identity more than it was treason. What if you gave him a path back? Others had disagreed. Lord Karstark spat at the idea. "He burned your home and murdered your brothers. If he is to return, it should be in pieces." But Karstark's opinion no longer held weight. His execution had silenced many, and Robb's word now held the weight of a king uncontested. Then came the Raven, a letter written in Theon's hand, smuggled from the Iron Islands. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly. It was a confession of fear, of weakness, of being torn between the salt and the snow. He wrote of Yara's cold scorn, of Balon's iron heart, and of the silence that followed his so-called victory. "I was never your enemy, Robb," it ended. "I was just too weak to be your brother." That letter had shaken Robb more than any battlefield loss. And so, after much thought, Robb Stark did something no one expected. He sent a raven back. It carried only 5 words: "Return to me and answer." A week later, Theon stood before him in chains. Thin, bruised, stripped of all noble pride. Robb stared at him long and hard, the men around watching for his judgment. "I won't beg," Theon said, eyes lowered. "I don't want your begging," Robb replied. "I want your loyalty." And to everyone's shock, he cut the chains. "You'll be watched, day and night," Robb said. "You'll have no command, no weapons, unless I give them. But you will ride with me." "Where?" Theon asked. "To your home," Robb said. "We're taking the Iron Islands." It was a mad idea, most said. The North was at war, the Freys growing restless, the Boltons already turning coats in secret. But Robb had made his choice. Winter was gone. He couldn't reclaim it, with fractured loyalties and betrayal still poisoning his court. But if he could take the Iron Islands, if he could burn out the rot at the source, take Balon's seat and replace it with Theon as a loyal warden of the Isles, then perhaps he could build something stable, and perhaps, just perhaps, he could show Westeros that a Stark's justice didn't always mean death. So ships were gathered, ravens sent. Men questioned their king's sanity, but obeyed. The North had bled for Robb, and if he demanded salt instead of snow, so be it. On a cold morning, the fleet set sail from Seaguard. Robb stood at the prow of the lead ship, cloak whipping in the wind. Beside him stood Theon, no longer the proud ward of Eddard Stark, but a broken man with hollow eyes and a silent mouth. He watched the waves ahead, toward the Iron Isles, toward the home he had betrayed, and the legacy he had shattered. The sea offered no forgiveness. but Robb Stark did. And with the North behind him, and vengeance replaced by strategy, the young wolf prepared to conquer not just an island, but a piece of his broken heart. The voyage across the Sunset Sea was bitter and slow. Northern men were not made for ships. The deck groaned under unfamiliar feet, and the cold wind bit through wool and leather. Many were sick, some prayed, others eyed Theon with distrust that turned into open hatred the closer they got to the Iron Islands. Theon didn't speak unless spoken to. He ate little, slept less. Some nights Robb would find him alone at the stern, staring at the crashing waters, lips moving silently as if speaking to ghosts. On the fifth night, Lord Greatjon Umber cornered Robb below deck. The old warrior had tolerated much, but his patience frayed with each crashing wave. "Your Grace," he growled, "this ain't a war we asked for. The Greyjoys raided our coast, burned our villages, and your brother spit on your house. Why, in the drowned god's name, are we risking lives for his redemption?" Robb didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked the Greatjon in the eye and said simply, "Because if we can't make allies from broken men, we'll run out of men." That silenced him, not because it softened his heart. Pike, under the cover of night. The Iron Islands loomed like jagged fangs from the sea, all stone and salt. The kind of land that turned boys into hard men and hard men into monsters. Balon Greyjoy had no love left in him, no patience, no space for failure. When word came of Robb Stark sailing toward his shores with Theon alive and aboard, the old Kraken spat on the floor. "He dares bring that traitorous pup home as a guest," he roared. "He should have come." With Theon's head mounted on a pike, Yara Greyjoy tried to reason with her father. "If they've come to treat, we should listen. The North is still strong." Balon only laughed, bitter and wet. "If Stark thinks he can bring war to the sea, he'll drown like the rest of them." But Robb hadn't come to treat. Before dawn, the North struck. They didn't attack Pike directly, that would have been foolish. Instead, they landed on Harlaw first, where the Ironborn were weakest. Theon led the first charge, sword in hand, face stone-cold. The men of the North followed reluctantly, some hoping to see him fall. But Theon did not fall. He fought like he was trying to bleed his sins out through steel. Village by village, stronghold by stronghold, Robb pushed inland, securing food, weapons, and support. And to his surprise, not every Ironborn resisted. Some hated Balon's rule, his endless wars, his brutal taxes, his obsession with ancient glory. They didn't love Robb, but they feared his discipline and respected his power. By the time they reached Greatwick, Balon Greyjoy was rattled. He had underestimated the young wolf once before and lost the North's coastline because of it. But this was different. This time, Robb wasn't defending his lands. He was attacking. Balon sent ravens to the other islands. He recalled ships from raids, desperate to mount a defense. Pike's shores bristled with sails. Robb knew the final push would be bloody in the war tent. As the map lay sprawled before them, Robb turned to Theon. "I need you to speak to your people," he said. "Call for the gates of Pike to open. Convince them to abandon your father." "They won't listen to me," Theon said. "They hate me more than they fear you." "Then give them a reason to doubt your father," Robb said. "Challenge him, break him." Theon hesitated. His hands shook. "You want me to kill him?" Robb didn't answer. He didn't have to that night. Theon Greyjoy took a long boat with only a small escort and landed at Pike's southern dock, walking alone through the walls of his birthright. Balin awaited him in the throne room, eyes like stone, heart colder. "Still, you've returned like a whipped dog," Balon said, "begging at the feet of the wolf who leashed you." "No," Theon replied. "I've come to take what's mine." The hall erupted. Balin rose, fury lacing his voice. "You think you can challenge me, boy?" Theon didn't flinch. "I know I can." The challenge was set. Ironborn tradition demanded it be answered. And for the first time in decades, the old way would be tested. Father against son, kraken against kraken. And outside the walls, the young wolf waited, watching the tides, ready to strike with fire and fury should Theon fail. The rain fell, the rain fell. Hard on Pike, the night Theon challenged his father. The sea crashed angrily against the black rocks, as if it too sensed the storm within. The throne room was cold and vast, torches flickering along the ancient stone. Balon Greyjoy stood tall, in his salt-stained armor, eyes sharp as flint. Theon faced him in silence, the weight of 1,000 regrets sitting heavy on his shoulders. The Ironborn gathered to watch, not out of loyalty, but hunger. Blood always fed their thirst for strength. If Theon killed his father, they'd call it kinslaying. But if Balin killed Theon, it would only reaffirm what they believed, that weakness had no place in the Iron Islands. Neither father nor son spoke as they circled each other. They didn't need to. Balin struck first, swift and cruel, like the sea. Theon barely deflected the blow. He wasn't stronger. He wasn't even faster. But he had something Balin I did. "You were a Stark's dog. You made me a ghost," Theon spat back. "You never wanted me back, just my usefulness." They fought like men possessed. Theon's knuckles bled. His arm trembled. Balon battered him, blow after blow. But Theon didn't fall. Not this time. He took the pain, took the hate, took every lesson he'd learned in Winterfell, in betrayal, in the eyes of Robb Stark, and turned it into fire. When the final moment came, it wasn't glorious. It wasn't clean. Balin overreached, a slight stumble on the wet stone, just enough. Theon slid his blade through his father's gut and twisted. Balin gasped, eyes wide in disbelief, more from insult than pain. He crumpled without a word. The room went silent. No cheers, no mourning, just the sound of the sea outside and the heavy breath of a broken sun. Theon turned, soaked in blood, and faced the watching captains. "The old way is dead," he said. "The Salt Throne will no longer answer to mad kings and wasted sons. The Iron Islands will bow to the north, or be broken." Yara stepped forward. Her face was unreadable, eyes full of conflict. She looked at her brother for a long time. Then she knelt, one by one. The captains followed. By sunrise, the banners of House Stark flew from the towers of Pike. Robb entered the keep, not as a conqueror, but as a king, claiming order from chaos. He passed the shattered throne room and found Theon alone, sitting on the salt throne with his head bowed, blood still staining his hands. "You did what needed to be done," Robb said quietly. Theon didn't look up. "I'm a kinslayer now. In the eyes of the drowned god, I'm cursed." Robb stepped closer. "The drowned god can curse you, but the North will judge you by your actions." "You trust me?" Theon asked, voice barely above a whisper. I trust what you chose. A week later, the Iron Islands formally bent the knee. Yara was named Warden of the Isles under the crown of the king in the north. She held command, but Theon was the symbol, the broken heir turned loyal brother. Robb had not just won a war, he had taken an enemy and turned him into a message. The Boltons, watching from the north, grew anxious. The Freys whispered in their halls. The Lannisters, far in the south, received word with contempt, but also fear. The north wasn't crumbling, it was expanding, but not all wounds heal so easily. Among Robb's bannermen, mistrust simmered beneath the surface. Many still whispered that Theon should have died. Others resented the blood spilled for islands that offered no love in return. And Robb himself, though his crown sat firm, and his voice carried power, carried a heaviness in his heart. He had chosen mercy, he had chosen strategy, but had he chosen wisely as the northern fleet began preparations to return home? Ravens flew from the east. The White Walkers had breached the wall, and everything Robb had built, every life spared, every alliance forged, would now be tested against death itself. The fires in Pike's towers still burned as the northern fleet prepared to set sail. The waves hissed beneath the hulls of wooden ships, and the banners of House Stark and Greyjoy fluttered together in a strange, uneasy alliance. Robb Stark stood at the shore, watching the horizon, a raven's scroll clenched in his fist. Snowflakes drifted down slowly, soft but unnatural. It was too early in the year for snow this far west. The message from Castle Black had been short, but grim. The wall is broken. The dead march. It changed everything. Robb had built his campaign on reclaiming lost ground and punishing old betrayals. But war against the living was simple. Swords, loyalty, vengeance. This was something else entirely. A war against death. No army, no honor, no politics, just survival. He gathered his bannermen in Pike's Hall. Lords of the North stood in their worn leather and chainmail, blood still drying on their cloaks from the Ironborn skirmishes. "We sail home at first light," Robb said. "The real war is coming from the north." Some grumbled. Lord Cherwin spoke first. "And what of the Ironborn? Will they stand with us, or slit our throats the moment our backs turn?" Robb looked to Theon. "Answer him." Theon stepped forward, eyes still shadowed from his duel with his father. "The Ironborn will stand, not because they believe in your gods or your honor, but because death takes everything, salt or snow." He paused, then added, "I will ride north with you. I will die there, if I must." Silence followed, cold and uncertain, but it was enough. They set sail the next day. Theon rode with Robb, not as a prisoner, not quite as a brother, but something between the two. Yara stayed behind to secure the Isles, to keep their fleet intact should Westeros fall. She watched her brother go with a nod, not out of affection, but respect. He was no longer the foolish boy who tried to be both Stark and Greyjoy. He had chosen his path. The journey northward was harder than the way down. The sea turned violent, and the skies grew darker the closer they came to the mainland. By the time they reached White Harbor, the city was already preparing for siege. The dead had taken Eastwatch. Wildlings had poured through the wall, fleeing, not from men, but from monsters. Robb disembarked with an urgency none had seen in him before. He no longer moved like a boy playing king. He was a man who knew the cost of delay. Maester Rylon met them with more ravens, more horror, thousands of them, dead things, marching through the woods, no mercy, no rest. Robb assembled his war council at once. Theon stood beside him, scarred, silent, sharp. "We need the Vale," Robb said. "We need the Riverlands, even the South, if they'll listen. The North alone cannot win this." "But the Lannisters won't come," said Lady Mormont bitterly. "They'll let us bleed, and then scavenge the bones." "We won't ask them," Robb said. "We'll force their hand." "How?" the great Jon asked. "With what army?" Robb turned to Theon with their fear. Robb Stark, king in the north, had claimed the Iron Islands and bent a kraken to his will. He had defeated Balon Greyjoy, united snow and salt, and now called upon every lord of Westeros to stand with him or fall to the Dark Dot. At first, there was silence. But then something strange happened. The phrase, "cowards though they were sent," word they would hold the trident against the dead. The Arryns, long quiet in their mountain, agreed to ride with the North, and in King's Landing. Even Cersei Lannister, cold and cruel as ever, paused when she heard the news. Robb Stark was no longer the boy she'd mocked. He was becoming a legend. As the North gathered at Winterfell, now retaken by Stark loyalists, while Robb was at sea, snow began to fall harder. The walls were thick with soldiers, the courtyards alive with blacksmiths, carts, and fear. One night, just before the moon rose high, a horn blew at the gate. A man wrapped in black furs stumbled through the snow, eyes sunken, face pale, a scar down one cheek. It was Jon Snow. He had come from beyond the wall, with fire in his words and terror in his voice. "They're coming," he said. "We have days, maybe less." He looked at Robb. "We'll need every man, even those we once called enemies." Robb didn't flinch. "Then we'll fight beside the dead if we must," he said, voice steady. "But we do not run." The great hall of Winterfell hadn't seen so many men since before the fall. Fires blazed in every hearth, yet the cold still clung to the stone walls, like the memory of ghosts that refused to leave. Robb stood at the head of the war table, surrounded by faces hardened by loss. Jon Snow, Theon Greyjoy, Lady Mormont, Lord Umber, Seer Roderick, even Glover had returned. The Stark banner flew once more over Winterfell, but what stood ahead made all their victories feel hollow. Jon's voice was grim, every word weighed down by what he'd seen. "They don't stop, they don't sleep, they don't fear. Thousands, tens of thousands, and now they have giants." The room fell silent. Even the great Jon paled at that. Robb looked over the map. "Eastwatch has fallen, the last hearth to how long until they reach us?" Jon shook his head. "A few days, if that. They're marching fast, and it's not just them. Every village they pass adds more to their numbers. Anyone who dies joins their army." Theon stood beside the hearth, arms crossed. "We'll burn the land behind us if we must. Leave nothing for them to raise." "They don't need food," Jon said darkly. "Only flesh." Lady Mormont, fierce despite her youth, stepped forward. "Then we hold Winterfell to the last. There's no retreat." Robb nodded. "We make our stand here, all of us." As the meeting broke, Robb pulled Jon aside. For a moment, the weight of kingship slipped away, and only brothers remained. "You should have sent word sooner," Robb said. Jon gave a weak smile. "Wouldn't have believed me anyway. I believe you now." Outside, the army of the North grew. Blacksmiths hammered blades day and night. Women stitched armor. Children carried arrows. Ravens flew from the towers non-stop, calling allies, warning the far corners. Most ignored them. Some mocked the message. But the smart ones began to listen. Even seer Davos Seaworth arrived, leading a small band of men sworn to Stannis's memory. He died fighting the Boltons, Davos said. Least I can do is help fight something worse. Gendry came to, strong, fast, swinging a hammer like a man possessed. I don't know anything about kings or politics, he said, but I know how to fight. Every sword counted. Then came a bitter surprise. Brienne of Tarth arrived with Alanister. He rode with only 2 men and no banner. Winterfell's gates almost didn't open. Robb met him in the yard, flanked by archers ready to kill. You've got nerve, Kingslayer, Robb said coldly. Jaime dismounted. I didn't come for forgiveness. I came because the dead don't care whose throat I cut 10 years ago. Jon, ever the calmer voice, stepped beside Robb. He's right. He's a bastard, but he's still a sword. Robb looked at Jaime, eyes full of every reason to kill him. But then he remembered what was coming. Then fight. And if you run, you won't make it to the wall before I catch you. That night, Theon sat alone beneath the godswood. The old weirwood tree watched silently, its red leaves drifting in. The wind like blood. He didn't pray. He didn't believe in any god, drowned, old or new. But he needed peace. Robb found him there. You don't have to fight, Robb said. You've done enough. You gave us the Ironborn. You gave me my chance. Theon looked up. You forgave me, but I haven't. Robb sat beside him. I forgave you because I had to, because war makes enemies out of brothers. But now, I need you as my brother again. Theon nodded slowly. Then I'll die like one. In the skies above, the first white raven flew. Winter had truly come, and with it, the dead. The horns blew 2 nights later, 1, 2, 3, long, low, and shaking the bones of every man. Winterfell. They were here, beyond the trees, in the mist and silence. The White Walkers watched. The first scream came just before dawn. A scout, one of the younger lads from House Hornwood, had been posted near the outer ridge beyond Winterfell gates. He never made it back. When his corpse was found, eyes wide and throat frozen solid, no one spoke. There was no need. The dead had arrived. Robb stood on Winterfell's battlements, the cold cutting through his furs like knives. He looked across the snow-covered field beyond the walls. A white mist hovered on the horizon. It wasn't fog, it was something alive. It moved like breath, like dread itself. They're waiting, Jon said, stepping beside him, eyes on the same horizon. They always wait, not for strategy, for fear. Below, Winterfell was a hive of last-minute desperation. Fires were lit across the trenches. Archers were posted on the walls. Valyrian steel and dragonglass. What little they had was passed out to the most trusted warriors. The smiths worked with bleeding hands. The women of the north stood with blades. No one was spared from the line. Not this time. Gendry led a squad reinforcing the walls. Arya trained young fighters in the yard with her usual sharp silence. Davos drilled the archers. Even Jaime Lannister, one-handed and half-armored, commanded a flank. No one questioned it anymore. Everyone knew what they were fighting. Death itself. Inside the crypts, the weak and the young were hidden. But it didn't feel safe. Nothing about this night felt safe. Robb moved through his men, helmet in hand. They looked at him as they would a god, but he didn't feel like one. He felt like a boy on a borrowed throne. And yet he stood taller than ever before. Because fear, in moments like these, was a luxury. He would lead, or they would all die. He found Theon by the broken towers near the inner wall, overlooking the godswood. "Still here?" Robb asked, almost smiling. Theon looked up. "Where else would I go? You could have left on a ship. You could have gone back to Yara. She still calls you blood." "I'm tired of running," Theon said. "If I'm to die, let it be here, for something real." Robb nodded. "Then stand with us." One last time, the horns blew again. This time not from the scouts, from the walls. They were coming. The mist parted, and from it came a soundless, terrible march. Figures shambled forward in waves, barely human, some still dressed in tattered cloaks and chainmail, others in wildling furs. Children, men, women, all dead. Behind them, further back, taller shadows walked slowly and deliberately, white walkers, glacial eyes glowing in the dark. And in the very distance, though hard to see, the shape of the Night King, mounted on his dead steed. Winterfell shook with the sound of war drums, not from the north, but from within. "We open fire on your command, your grace," shouted Davos from the walls. Robb's jaw clenched. "Loose the arrows." Now flames lit the sky. Thousands of arrows rained down, some tipped in dragonglass, others in fire. The front lines of the dead collapsed. They burned, screamed, but they didn't stop, not for a second. They crawled over their own burning kind. They tore through the trenches like beasts, some falling, others surging through. Jon and Robb descended to the front gates, swords drawn. "You're the king in the north now," Jon said grimly. "Time to fight like one." "I don't intend to die in my own yard," Robb growled. And they met the dead head-on. The gates burst open. Steel rang against ice. Men screamed. Arrows rained. The snow turned red and black. Theon fought like a mad dog, slicing through whites with dragonglass daggers, his face caked in blood and frost. Brienne guarded the northern flank like a mountain, never falling. Arya vanished into the chaos, only to reappear behind death again and again. And Robb Stark fought like the wolf he had always been. His blade, soaked in fire, cut through nightmare after nightmare. His cloak burned, his shield shattered, but he stood. Hours passed, time bent, bodies fell in piles, fires died, the walls shook, and then a shriek from above. A shape tore through the night sky, a dragon, but not one of fire, one of death. Viserion wings torn, flesh rotted, blue fire spitting from its mouth, dove toward the battlefield. The Night King was here. Robb looked to Jon. Their eyes met. No words were needed. They would have to end this now, or Winterfell would fall before the sun ever rose again. The ground trembled as Viserion descended from the black sky, his wings shredding the clouds, his breath glowing an eerie blue. Fire, not of warmth, but of pure, freezing death, exploded from his jaws and tore through Winterfell's northern battlements. Stone shattered, men screamed, the wall collapsed, burying dozens beneath a rain of rubble and frost. Robb barely had time to pull a wounded archer out of the way before the second blast came. It ripped through the courtyard, setting everything ablaze in cold flame that did not burn but consumed. Jon Snow shouted across the yard, "He's here. The Night King is here." There was no strategy now. No shield walls, no flanks. Just survival. The defenders scattered as the dead surged forward in a final, furious wave, their numbers swollen by the very men and women who had fallen minutes before. The trenches were overrun, the fires failed. Even the dragonglass seemed to slow them only slightly now. The dead were relentless. Robb Stark moved through the chaos like a man possessed. His sword was slick with blood and ice. His face, barely visible through smoke and ash, was the face of a king not fighting for glory, but for every breath, every child hiding in the crypts, every soul behind the walls. "Fall back to the keep," he roared. Everyone inside. Jaime Lannister and Brienne guarded the retreat, cutting down wave after wave of whites. Sir Davos pulled the wounded into safety, with Gendry at his side, the younger man wielding his hammer with wild fury. But not everyone made it. Lady Mormont was the first great loss. A giant, undead, she stood alone, a girl no taller than his shin. But she did not flee, she charged. The thing grabbed her in a massive hand, bones cracking. But with her last breath, she drove a dragonglass dagger into its eye. The giant fell, and so did she. Theon saw it happen, and he did not hesitate. With 2 axes in hand, he fought like a man who no longer feared death. Whites fell around him like timber. His eyes burned with something that looked like peace. Every slash of his blade was penance. Every kill a prayer. But the dead kept coming. Inside the great hall, Robb, Jon, and their remaining forces barricaded the doors. Children sobbed. Elders muttered old prayers. Sansa stood in the back, blade in hand, trembling but silent. Jon turned to Robb. "It's him. He's not just here to kill. He wants to end everything we are." Robb's face was streaked with ash and blood. "Then we go to him. Just us, just us." Jon nodded. "One last charge." Robb gave a weak smile. "Like we did against the Boltons. This will be worse. Then we better not miss." They slipped through the side entrance, Theon close behind, determined to finish what he had started. The Night King had landed in the Godswood. He stood beneath the weirwood tree, silent and still, as if mocking their faith in the old gods. Whites circled him like shadows. Robb, Jon, and Theon charged through them. It was a blur, steel against ice, screams against silence. Theon broke first through the ring of dead, striking down to whites before making for the Night King himself, and he stopped. The Night King looked at him, not with hate, not even interest, but cold acknowledgement, as if Theon were nothing more than a delay. Theon screamed and ran toward him, spear in hand. One flick of the Night King's wrist, and the spear shattered. Theon collapsed with a gasp, impaled by an ice blade, mouth full of blood. Robb reached him seconds later, just in time to see the life leave his eyes. Jon howled and charged. The Night King raised his hand, but this time, the fire Jon had waited for came from the sky above. Dragon descended, Daenerys astride him, eyes blazing. She had come, after all. Fire engulfed the Godswood. For a heartbeat, it looked like hope. But when the flames died, the Night King still stood, unburned, unmoved. He looked to Robb, and then he drew his sword. The final battle, not just for winter, but for the fate of the North itself, had begun. Smoke curled from the godswood, mixing with the steam rising off the scorched earth where Drogon's fire had torn through the ranks of the dead. Trees were blackened. The sacred weirwood bled from its carved eyes, steam rising from its sap like it mourned, and still the Night King stood, unburned, untouched, his cold blue eyes locked onto Robb Stark. Robb's chest heaved, lungs clawing for air. Blood dripped from a shallow cut across his cheek, but his grip on his sword didn't waver. Beside him, Jon stood, ready, Longclaw gleaming faintly with frost. Daenerys hovered above on Drogon, circling like a hawk, but even she looked uncertain now. The fire hadn't worked. The dragon hadn't worked. What would? The Night King took a step forward, slow and deliberate, dragging his greatsword across the stone path with a noise like a scream frozen in ice. Wights swarmed around the clearing, eyes glowing, but none attacked. They waited, watched, as if this moment belonged only to the three now standing against him. Now, Robb said. Jon lunged first. He struck low, fast, aiming for the side. The Night King met his blade with ease, parrying it with the strength of something more elemental than man. They clashed again and again, Jon grunting, blood flying with every stroke. But the Night King was faster, stronger. He moved like death itself, no anger, no sound, just relentless finality. Robb circled to flank, but the Night King turned in a flash, forcing him back with a wide swing. Robb ducked, rolled beneath the blade, and came up with a strike, aimed for the back of the knee. But again, the sword was blocked. It was hopeless. No gaps, no weakness, just ice. "You're not just a man," Robb gasped, circling again. The Night King tilted his head slightly, as if amused. Then he lifted his free hand, and the ground moved. Theon's body twitched. So did dozens of others, northern men, Mormonts, even the Hornwood boy. "No," Robb whispered. "No, no." They rose. Their eyes glowed blue. Even Theon Jon turned. "Fall back." But there was nowhere to run. The godswood was surrounded now. The dead formed a ring, silent and motionless, except for the faint rattle of their bones and the scrape of steel on stone. They weren't attacking, just watching, like the Night King wanted Robb and Jon to understand. They were already dead. Above Daenerys shouted Dracarys again, but Draken didn't descend. He circled, uncertain. If fire didn't work, what would? And then out of the trees came Arya Stark, silent as the snow. She didn't scream, she didn't charge. She flew through the air like shadow, Valyrian steel dagger in hand, aimed for the Night King's back. But he turned. Fast, faster than anything should move. He caught her by the throat midair. Jon screamed. Arya gasped, dagger still in her hand. The Night King tightened his grip, but Arya dropped the blade from one hand, caught it in the other, and stabbed him through the heart. The steel sank deep. The Night King's eyes widened just slightly, and then he shattered, not like Glassdot, like a world breaking. He exploded in a burst of wind and frost, knocking Arya back and hurling Jon and Robb to the ground. The wights screamed, high-pitched and unnatural, then crumbled, one by one, falling like puppets with their strings cut. Theon collapsed again, this time peacefully. The godswood fell silent. Robb lay flat on his back, blinking at the sky. Snowflakes drifted down, soft again. Real snow, not ash or bone dust, Jon crawled over to Arya. She was breathing, dazed, bruised, but alive. "You did it," he whispered. She just nodded. Drogon landed nearby with a ground-shaking thud. Daenerys slid down and stared at the shattered pieces of the Night King. Now nothing but melting shards of blue glass. It was over. Winterfell had survived, but the cost. As dawn crept over the battlements, Robb Stark stood in the Godswood among the dead Mormont. Theon, half the North, hundreds had given their lives, and yet they had held. He knelt by Theon's body, gently closing his brother's eyes. "You died a Stark," Robb whispered, "and I won't forget." From the walls above, the horns sounded again, not in alarm, but victory. The dead had fallen, but the war for Westeros was only just beginning.